Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Kate Kehler, the Executive Director of the Winnipeg Social Planning Council. Prior to joining the council, Kate was with the John Howard Society of Manitoba. She also lived and worked in Iqaluit, where she was the Executive Director of the Law Society of Nunavut and Thompson. Kate, thanks for joining us. Let's start with a little on what the Winnipeg Social Planning Council is.
Actually, so we're an organization that is 100 years old. We came out of the same conditions that led to the general strike of 1919. At that time, though, it was an approach that was about bringing the charitable sector together to try and address those social needs. And we've since evolved into an organization that does a lot more of social policy, progressive public policy, recognizing that systemic change has to happen if we really are going to make sure that we have an equitable society.
In April, the Council and other partners released a Manitoba report card. It was called Broken Promises, Stolen Futures. What were some of the findings?
Well, some of the findings were, so this is on child poverty, and just a quick history is that we are a partner in the Campaign 2000 national organization, which came about because in 1989, the federal government all came together and passed a unanimous motion to end child poverty by the year 2000. Well, here we are in 2020, and we haven't done it. So the findings are, unfortunately, that in Manitoba, we're actually doing quite poorly. We're one of the worst provinces as far as child poverty goes. And we understand that it's very concentrated, especially here in Winnipeg Centre, and then also in Churchill. An accompanying report that went along with that came out last fall actually showed that of the 5 federal ridings with child poverty, Manitoba actually has 3 of the 5 with the highest child poverty rate.
You know, as you mentioned, it was unanimously approved in the House of Commons to end poverty by the year 2000. Of course, we're not even close. This report says it will take 697.5 years to end child poverty in Manitoba. What does that say to you?
Well, because the report says that if we can keep going at the pace we are, that's how long it's going to take to end child poverty. We actually know that we can do things. So we don't want to take away from the fact that the CCB was incredibly helpful. It did do a lot. It lifted a number of families out of poverty. But while that's the other point I want to make, while we focus on child poverty, kids are in poverty because their families are in poverty. Mm-hmm. So there are all sorts of things that we need to be able to do, and we can do as a society, to lift those families out of poverty so that they can better support their children. So here in Manitoba, one of the key findings of our report was the fact that as a province, we somehow benefit less from federal transfer payments than other provinces are doing, or we're doing less with it. So because other provinces have looked at it and have said, well, we need to build on what the federal government is doing. And unfortunately, the policies here in Manitoba often take away from that, such as having a very low minimum wage. We know that a majority of single parent-led families are women-led, and they're working minimum wage jobs trying to support a family.
Well, it's one thing to put a number, a statistic out there, and in this case it's 85,450 kids in Manitoba alone. But the report does also include, people's personal stories. Were there any that stick out for you?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in the report that we have, we highlight a newcomer to Manitoba who, by all accounts, has done everything right. She arrived here as a young girl, worked to help support her family when she could, made it through high school, made it through university, amongst a lot of adversity. And she's now working, a single parent herself. But basically, when just the minimum costs are met, she has about $680 to feed and clothe herself and her child for an entire month. That's working a job and a half.
How do the numbers in Manitoba stack up against other provinces? You said we are one of the worst here.
Yes, we are, unfortunately, and we have been for a very long time. There was a slight boost to we were doing a little bit better for 1 year with the CCB. Unfortunately, changes that then came about to, say, rent assist would have taken away some of that ground. So here in Manitoba, we're often actually Saskatchewan actually has surpassed us. They've actually managed to do more with their federal transfers than we have as a province.
What are some of the things you'd like to see happen with those transfers?
Well, clearly what we need to see is systems reform. And number one is what we highlight in the report is the changes that are needed to child and family services. This was, there is a practice there, again, going back to the transfer payments. This began in the year 2006, where the provincial government began to take whatever, however you want to use that word, into their general revenue and the federal transfers to support children once those kids are taken in care. Now, I'm not making the accusation that that was a financial incentive to take more kids into care, but it was certainly it was not a financial disincentive to not do that. So those payments were taken into the provincial coffers to help pay for the child welfare system. We saw an increase. We had about 6,000 kids in care in 2006, and we now have 11,000. So it clearly shows that that's an approach that does not work because we know we have amazing programs that are happening right here, such as family conferencing from Mum Away, that actually works to support the families so that they actually can hang on to their kids. And we know that that saves us in the long run. It saves us in education, it saves us in health, and it certainly saves us in justice, because we know there's a direct link between kids who are in care and going on into the justice system.
The report also pointed to poverty being both racialized and gendered. Can you talk about that?
Well, again, that's, Sarah's story is this very prime example of that, is the fact that we simply know that people who are racialized and gendered, they face the hardest hits of poverty. We simply know that women are paid less than men for different jobs. Also, women are more relegated to low-paying jobs. So we're also seeing with COVID-19 that, of course, that a lot of the impacts that are going to be felt by women, because women are the ones that primarily occupy the jobs at the lowest ranks, and those are the ones that are unable to sustain themselves in this time.
Kate, we got to step aside for a quick break, and then we will discuss how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting those who have less. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Kate Kehler, the Executive Director of the Winnipeg Social Planning Council. And Kate, we've been talking about this report card, and there's a part in it that says, in Manitoba, the multi-generational effects of colonialism are a leading cause of child poverty, cultural disruption, and dispossession of the land in Canada has created amongst Indigenous peoples a near total psychological, physical, and financial dependency on the state. Can you talk about why that was included in the report?
Well, we wanted to make sure that we always acknowledge those issues because as an organization, we do look at systemic issues and systemic solutions. Unfortunately, oftentimes when we bring out statistics around, say, Indigenous peoples and being highly impacted by poverty, some people unfortunately take the message that has something to do with their race, when actually we want to highlight that it's basically due to racism. So we have systemic racism. We know that it disproportionately affects Indigenous people. We know that there are times when we have 85% of the people who are incarcerated right now in the province of Manitoba are Indigenous. We know that is because we have systemic issues. It is certainly more likely for somebody to be involved in the justice system depending on their race. That's what the stats show us.
The latest, we're going to pick up on that in a minute, but the latest report card was issued during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm told that was done on purpose. You know, the media has kind of got its mind on other things right now. Why was this a good time to release it?
Well, we thought that it was very important to release it at this time because we know that people who are facing these issues now in the midst of COVID, they were already in crisis. And we want this paper to be part of the discussion about what needs to happen coming out of it. So obviously there's a ton out there. People are talking about, we don't want normal to return. Normal had its issues. And the one thing that COVID-19 has done is to point out what some people like to call them, the cracks in the system. This person fell through the cracks. That person fell through the cracks. We actually know that there are gaping chasms in our systems that people get pushed towards, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So we want to make sure that the data that's here shows how bad it was prior to COVID-19 and why we need those extra supports to pull people out.
Among the other reasons, some of these people are living in crowded housing. They have chronic health issues. They rely on public transit, have food insecurity, among many other things. Has federal and provincial government been providing proper assistance during this pandemic?
Well, I think that the federal government has done its best to kickstart something that they did not foresee that they would have to kickstart. So in the absence of having done the work prior to COVID-19, yes, I believe they are doing what they can at this time. But I do believe that the province actually needs to step up and do more and build on those supports rather than look at ways of saving from their own provincial budget.
As has been pointed out, and I'm sure you're well aware of it, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit is more generous than the wages of working parents or those receiving welfare benefits. So what do you make of that?
I guess, again, taking that long picture view, what we'd like to show is you see if actually it would be nice to see how people feel coming out of COVID, having actually received that much more money. Because we know that in other jurisdictions when they've tried, or certainly here in Manitoba, when we've tried a basic income experiment, people actually spend the money wisely. We know that when people are placed in desperate situations, that's when they make desperate choices. So a very simple study that was done maybe a few years ago now, they actually took a number of soon-to-be first-time single moms in poverty and just gave them $80 a month extra. That was it. And guess what they found? They found that the moms spent them on prenatal vitamins and better food. And the outcomes were lower premature birth, higher birth rates, weights. And so it actually proves that when people have what they need, they actually make good decisions. But we have, again, going back to my organization's history, we were, looking at our history and looking at what was going on 100 years ago. And I picked up a government, policy manual, and they talked about single moms. And they were like, well, we can't give them too much money because then they'll just become lazy and stay on it. So we have to give them just barely enough. And that's been our approach for the last 100 years. And where has it got us? Nowhere.
Ontario did have a basic living wage program that it was testing out and then was cancelled. There are some, the NDP in particular, are pushing to have this continued. Are you hopeful that maybe this money will continue to flow?
Yes, I think it should. There are a number of models out there. It does require more conversation. Some people think, well, that's, basic income, silver bullet. It's not. It's a little bit more complicated how we apply one. But I think what we need to do is we need to agree on what it actually is necessary for somebody to get by in order to be able to participate. Now, there are all different ways of calculating that. So right now, it's $16 an hour is a minimum wage for somebody. That's what we need for a living wage for somebody to be able to participate. And even our own report, we all find fault with our own report, even though we argue that our poverty measure is more accurate in our report than the market basket measure. We're still asking a single parent of 2 kids to get by on $36,000 a year. That is incredibly difficult to do.
The flip side of that, I guess, is, there's already talk of the austerity measures that are likely to happen post-pandemic to pay for some of these programs that are there right now. What concerns do you have with those and the greater impact on poverty in general, not just child poverty?
Well, very concerned about the short-sightedness of it. I mean, we do need to learn from our history again. So we do, we can look back at the lessons learned from 2008. I'm certainly not the only one to point out that different jurisdictions approached it differently. And those that approached it through an austerity measure actually took longer to come out of it than those that actually threw in social supports and help people out of poverty. So we're very concerned, there's a short-term effect of balancing your budget, and there's the long-term harm of not addressing the social deficit that poverty causes. And again, we highlight it every single time. We spend about $200 million a year incarcerating about 2,000 people in this province. What could we better spend that money on preventing that sort of thing from happening in the first place?
We're also seeing, mass layoffs or people that have lost their jobs currently that may continue to not have a job to go back to. Do you think we're going to see increased numbers of those experiencing poverty post-pandemic?
I think so. I think a lot of people were struggling before. I cannot remember what CCPA's number is, but we were very high as a province in the number of people who were one paycheck away. That was not a surprise to those families. They knew it. They knew that how they're juggling their bills now. I think, sadly, the fact that the larger society has seen how close so many people are, and how it just takes something like a pandemic to throw people that far out of work. Hopefully, we're going to actually get more prepared for it. How much better off we would be if we weren't at the level of poverty that we had going into COVID. We would need less of this emergency support. And again, we always spend way more money dealing with a crisis, dealing with an emergency, than we would if we spent it on prevention.
Kate, you keep mentioning the justice system, and we're going to talk about that coming up. We do just need to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Kate Kehler. Welcome back. Our guest this week is Kate Kehler, the Executive Director of the Winnipeg Social Planning Council. But Kate, you were with the John Howard Society for many years. As of this past weekend, there were nearly 500 people connected with the prison system in Canada who have now tested positive for COVID-19, both prisoners and employees. What concerns do you have there?
Well, again, it just is a very concrete example of what we've been concerned with for a very long time. The prison system that we currently have right now is not safe for either the inmates or for the people that work in them. They are failing in the job of rehabilitation, which is supposed to be their main point. Their main function is to rehabilitate. But unfortunately, when you're looking at budgets, oftentimes what gets cut is the programs that actually help people. So COVID, again, is just a very concrete, simple, quick example of how everybody is impacted when we don't look after that population properly.
And we're hearing from, the correctional investigator who released a report about human rights being violated with the confinement that's going on right now. Advocates and family members have been pushing for early releases. Do you think that would help here?
Well, yes, of course. So, right now, the current situation that we have in the remand center is unacceptable. We're having youth getting locked up with adults, and that's something that, it goes against every single correctional philosophy out there. But because we don't have the ability to isolate anywhere else, that's the process that they're using. There are any number of different approaches to justice that could be used. But here, unfortunately, in Manitoba, we still hold the highest number of people in incarceration prior to actually even being convicted or sentenced for anything. So our default is actually incarceration, when actually it should be based in community correction. So I happen to be the chair of the Restorative Justice Association of Manitoba. We have any number of phenomenal organizations across the province who actually work with people to keep them out of incarceration and keep them in the community. And for people who are out there who believe this is somehow a quote-unquote thug-hugging, soft-on-crime approach to it, just don't understand what it is. Actually, restorative justice puts the victim in the center of the process. And it's all about making sure that this doesn't actually happen again. So whatever the conditions that led to the crime, and yes, we do approach it with the idea that there is an imbalance. A crime happens because they're imbalanced, and that does come directly from poverty. It comes from the addictions and the mental health issues that come out of poverty. So when you address those, you actually assist the person who created the harm, who did the crime, to actually be accountable for what they did and actually help them then change that. And what happens is that the victim has much better comes out of that process feeling much more informed and much more at ease, because they understand all of the hard work that the person who did them harm has had to do to change.
In that role as chair, you were part of a gathering late last year that focused on what Winnipeg's chief of police had called an unprecedented level of violence. Last year we saw a record number of homicides for Winnipeg. We're already surpassing where we were this time last year, and some are saying policing is not going to solve the problem. What are your thoughts on that?
I would have to agree. And both the current police chief and the past police chief, we've known this for a long time, actually. Crime prevention through social determinants has been a long-time position of the Social Planning Council. Security is the most expensive and least effective way of dealing with crime. We know, again, I'll look at other jurisdictions. It's not a surprise that Quebec, who has the best childcare system we have in Canada, also has some of the lowest rates of child poverty, and also lowest youth criminal justice involvement. And that's because they treat it as a social ill, and that's how they address it. So again, the third pillar of restorative justice is obviously the person who's committed the harm, the victim, but also it gives context to the whole society about why the situation happened, and that should empower us as a society to change the conditions.
Kate, people have called this a war on the poor. Is that how you see it?
That's a hard one. Do you know what I mean? We work with members of the WPS. We know that they're out there to do a job, but I would say that as a society, we have defaulted to the Winnipeg Police Service to actually deal with every single issue that we have failed to deal with in our other systems. So they are not social workers. They are not mental health workers. They are not any. Some of them have training. Some of them have a natural affinity for it. Other ones are not. They should be a police force because that's what they are. But their involvement should be the last line that we get to. And unfortunately, we've defaulted and we've made them the first.
Kate, we're short on time here, but you mentioned the Winnipeg Police. There's been 4 fatal Winnipeg police shootings this year, including the fatal shooting of 3 Indigenous people in 10 days, one of them a 16-year-old girl. What are your thoughts on what's happening here in the city lately?
I just think I wish we had more information. So it's really difficult for me. I'm not trying to skirt a really difficult issue, but we don't have enough information. So I look forward to that. But I also look forward to a time where we actually understand that it's not an accident. We actually are seeing an increase in the desperation. We're seeing an increase in people seeing the systems, our society, not working for them. So they respond in a particular way. And unfortunately, then with death, there is no chance of restoration. So you can't restore life. So we need to stop it before we get there.
Well, Kate, we have to hold the conversation there, but really appreciate you taking part in the show here for us.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. You can email us your comments or with any ideas for guests at news@aptn.ca. And this show and past episodes are available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.